Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what might just be the absolute most successful and, frankly, destructive character assassination in all of church history. We're going to stick strictly to the historical facts here to uncover exactly how a massive, pious lie was constructed. We'll look at how an institutional power structure systematically rewrote the legacy of one of early Christianity's most absolutely crucial figures. So, let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did a powerful, influential early Christian woman get transformed into a weeping, fallen sinner? For centuries, popular culture and church tradition have handed us a very specific image of Mary Magdalene. She's almost always framed as a repentant prostitute, defined entirely by her sexual sin. But as you'll see, this widely accepted narrative, it wasn't an accident. No way. It was a targeted, incredibly effective historical fiction born from this messy mix of politics, intentional misreading, and careful manipulation. To understand how we got here, we really need to start by looking at the actual data. Literally zero words, verses, or even vague hints in the entire New Testament actually call Mary Magdalene a prostitute or a sexual sinner. Just think about that for a second. The entire bedrock of this woman's global reputation for the last millennium and a half is based on absolutely zero biblical evidence. There is no proof in the source text. None. So if the text doesn't say it, who was she really? To figure that out, we're moving into phase 1 of our investigation, the biblical reality. When we actively peel back those heavy layers of later tradition, medieval art, and pop culture, a completely different person emerges from the text. The myth tells us she was a repentant prostitute, but the historical fact? Well, she was actually a wealthy sponsor and a fiercely independent leader. Jesus called her Mary of Magdala, and Magdala was a really prosperous fishing town at the time. Now, sure, the Bible does mention that Jesus healed her by casting out 7 demons, but we have to understand the context here. In the medical and cultural language of that era, 7 demons meant she suffered from a severe physical or mental illness. It had absolutely nothing to do with sexual sin. On top of that, if we look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, it notes that Mary used her own substantial wealth to fund Jesus' movement right out of her own pocket. She was an independent financier.
And she wasn't just a donor, she held a position of unmatched courage. In the early church, she actually carried a uniquely respected title, Apostolorum Apostola, which means apostle to the apostles. Why? Well, because the texts tell us she stood right there at the cross when male disciples like Peter basically cowardly fled the scene. And most importantly, she was the very first person to witness a resurrected Jesus. It was Mary who went and announced the resurrection to the men. She was, without a doubt, the most crucial witness in early Christianity.
So, how in the world do we get from a wealthy leader to a streetwalker? Well, that brings us to the scene of the crime. Phase 2, the master deception of 591 AD. Now, what's really interesting about this is how we can trace this massive shift back to one specific man, on one specific day, who basically completely altered history to simplify complex biblical stories for the illiterate masses of the 6th century. Consider the exact formula of this fabrication. Pope Gregory the Great took 3 completely distinct biblical women and artificially mashed them together into one fictionalized character. He took our wealthy sponsor, Mary of Magdala, he added Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and then crucially, he threw in an unnamed sinner from Luke chapter 7, a woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears and hair. By blending these 3 separate lives together into a single person, a brand new, highly convenient narrative was born.
And here is the historical smoking gun. In the fall of 591 AD, while delivering his famous homily 33 in Rome, Pope Gregory the Great issued an authoritative decree declaring that these separate women were all the exact same person. With a single stroke of institutional authority, he formally fused the wealthy leader, the devoted sister, and the weeping sinner. This catastrophic yet highly advantageous lie effectively erased the real Mary's legacy overnight. But we really have to ask ourselves, why was it so advantageous for them to do this?
That leads us directly into phase 3, the true motive, which was silencing women.
When we objectively investigate the why here, it reveals that this wasn't just some innocent misreading of a confusing text. This was a brilliant, deliberate political move by a strictly patriarchal 6th century institution that was facing a massive internal contradiction. So, the crucial point is understanding the church's dilemma at that time. Women were strictly forbidden from preaching or speaking at the altar. They were expected to be entirely subordinate to men.
Yet, the entire foundation of their religion rested on the fact that the most important witness to their central miracle was a powerful, independent female leader. That was a massive threat to male authority. So by reducing the ultimate female authority figure to her sexuality and sin, transforming her into a weeping penitent, they perfectly solved their problem. They basically replaced a model of female leadership with a model of female submission and obedience.
Which brings us to the immense cultural aftermath of all this. In Phase 4, a quiet apology centuries later.
The cultural damage of this lie was absolutely immense. I mean, it infected Western art and culture for centuries. If you look at Renaissance paintings, Mary Magdalene is almost always depicted as this highly sensual, weeping woman with bare shoulders clutching a skull, an identity that trickled straight down into modern pop culture, heavily influencing works like the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. But here is a fascinating counterpoint to that Western narrative. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted this lie. They preserved the historical truth, always honoring her as a saint equal to the apostles without ever merging her with the unnamed prostitute. It's a really stark contrast that proves this wasn't just some inevitable theological conclusion, it was a specific, localized Western institutional choice.
Let's see how this builds to a resolution over a crazy timeline. We start in 591 AD, with Pope Gregory creating the lie. Fast forward to 1969, yes, 1969, Pope Paul VI finally separates the three women in the Roman Missal. But notice, he did this very quietly. There were no grand press conferences to announce a millennium-long mistake. The church didn't exactly hire a PR firm to blast out that they'd been entirely wrong about her for over 1,000 years. Actually, it wasn't until 2016 that Pope Francis officially elevated her memorial to a feast day, finally restoring her rightful title as the Apostle to the Apostles.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer inertia of institutional power. 1,400 years. For 14 centuries, a targeted character assassination survived as official doctrine before it was fully retracted. That is 1,400 years where millions and millions of people were taught a fabricated version of history, specifically designed to alter societal power dynamics.
Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question to reflect on. How much of our cultural history is still shaped by a 6th century political lie? The myth of the repentant prostitute still lingers heavily in the minds of people today, proving that once a powerful institution writes a narrative, it is incredibly difficult to unwrite it. It really makes you wonder what other deeply held historical narratives that we accept as basic facts might actually be carefully constructed fabrications. Thank you for exploring the facts with me today. Stay curious, keep questioning the narrative, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.